Hello everyone and welcome to Meddysimplified. So in this video we will talk about types of joints. So types of joints based on their how they are moving, we are going to divide them. So the topic for today is types of joints. All right. So before going in the depth of the types of joints, it's very important to know that what are the types of bones, right? So here is the thumbnail and here is the link for the video on types of bones, which is also a video by me on this very basic topic. I request you to go to this link first, watch it, and then come back to this topic, which will be then it will be very helpful to maintaining the basics right from the bones, then joints, and then further uh, videos whichever I'll put on the basics of anatomy. So going further, types of joints. So types of joints, they are of three types according to me. They are of three types based on how they are moving. So if the joint is completely immovable, the joint is immovable, it can be immovable or it can be a a slightly movable joint, and it can be a completely or freely movable joint, right? A freely movable joint, so movable. So this thing that is immovable, slightly movable, or movable, this is not the actual classification. These joints are classified as fibrous joints, which is immovable joint. Then there is a cartilaginous joint, which is slightly movable, and then we have a synovial joint. Then we have a slight synovial joint, which is freely movable or completely movable. All right. So okay. So these are the three types of joints: fibrous joint, which is immovable; cartilaginous joint, which is slightly movable; and the synovial joint, which is freely movable or completely movable. So now let's know there are few subtypes, many subtypes, not few, of each of them. So let's get to know each of them one by one. So first we have sutures. Second, in fibrous joints we have gum fossas. Then third we have syndesmosis. Okay, behind below the gum fossas, leave some space as I'm leaving. If you are making the notes along with me, then syndesmosis is the third type of fibrous joint. So this was the immovable joint. Now talking about the cartilaginous joint, which is slightly movable, right? So in cartilaginous joint, it is very simple to remember. There are two types of cartilaginous joint. One is primary cartilaginous joint, CJ, I'll write, and second is secondary cartilaginous joint, CJ, secondary CJ. So this is the easier version of them, but there is a tougher version or another name of this joint. So the primary cartilaginous joint is also known as synchondrosis. Synchondrosis. So this is primary cartilaginous joint, whereas secondary cartilaginous joint is known as symphysis, as in we have pubic symphysis. So this were the slightly movable, or I'll say cartilaginous joint. Sorry. Then third we have synovial joint, which is completely movable. So now all the joints which we know, like plain synovial joint, all the types of joint, right? Whichever joint came in your mind when we started discussing this types of joint, all are included in the synovial joint. Most of them, if they are not in this list yet. So hinge joint, then we have pivot joint, then we have a condylar joint, then we have fifth ellipsoid joint, then we have sixth saddle joint, and at last everyone's favorite, ball and socket joint. So basically these are the types of joints which we have and the basic classification. Now we'll discuss examples of each type of joint and if you get a few important points about each of them, if there is something, right? So we'll start from the fibrous joint. The first one is the sutures. So sutures, we know it's usually in the skull, right? Between two adjacent skull bones, right? So there are also different types of sutures, right? So first we have a plain suture. 1 second. So first we have a plain suture. All right. Second we have a squamous suture. Third we have serrate suture. Fourth we have a denticulate suture. And last we have shin dialysis. It is also known as wedge groove joint. Okay, shin dialysis is also known as wedge groove joint. You can write it, and the spelling is actually shin dialysis. Lesis. Okay, so all this kind of joints have few examples and have few arrangement, which is very important to know. Okay, so first we have plain suture joint. So suppose these are the two bones. In between we have a fiber. Then we have a squamous joint, right? In squamous joint, they are lying one above the other, something like this. Okay, and in between we have this one bone, another bone, and in between we have the fibers. Then we have this serrate suture, saw-like margins of the bone. Okay, and in between, once again, the fibers. Then we have denticulate suture, kind of lock and key suture. It is that actual same shape of the opposite shape for them, and fibers in between. And then last we have shin dialysis. Okay, so now let's note down examples of each of them, right? So about plain suture, the example is internasal joint, the joint between the nasal bones, right? So internasal joint. Also interpalatine joint is an example of plain suture. Then second we have squamous. So there the temporoparietal suture, the suture between parietal bone and temporal bone over here. This is an example of squamous suture. Then serrate suture, we have an example that is a sagittal suture. Then for denticulate, we have example that is lambdoid suture. Denticulate, we have lambdoid suture. And the last, that is shin dialysis, which I told you, also known as wedge groove joint. The example is vomer sphenoid joint. The joint between the vomer and sphenoid is the example of shin dialysis. Make sure you don't make the mistake in the names, that is synchondrosis, shin dialysis, syndesmosis, and symphysis. Synchondrosis and symphysis are a cartilaginous joint, primary and secondary. Now talking about gymphosis, it also known as peg and socket joint. It is also known as peg and socket joint. So the gymphosis is known as peg and socket joint, and we have it is the joint between the gum and the tooth. Now, if we'll talk further, we have syndesmosis. Don't confuse it with shin dialysis, which is an example of suture joint, that is the vomer groove suture. Okay, not shin dialysis. This is syndesmosis. So the syndesmosis is example. It is usually the joint between the two. Usually we have this interosseous membrane, right? I'm sorry for the words. Example, we have this interosseous membrane in between the radius and ulna. So syndesmosis, the example is the interosseous membrane between radius and ulna, and also the interosseous membrane between tibia and fibula. So this was the syndesmosis, which is a type of fibrous joint. Now we will talk about the cartilaginous joint. So for cartilaginous joint, I already told you that is the primary cartilaginous joint and secondary cartilaginous joint. That we have two types of joint, and this primary is also known as synchondrosis, whereas the secondary is known as symphysis. So primary cartilaginous joint and secondary cartilaginous joint. So you'll be shocked to know that the primary ones are the temporary joint, whereas the secondary are a permanent joint. Just in case you should remember. Now, example for primary cartilaginous joint is all costochondral joints. All costochondral joint, the joint between the All the costochondral joint are example of primary cartilaginous joint. Now second we have the secondary cartilaginous joint. So example is manubrum's sternal joint. So it is the joint between this manubrum of the sternum and the body of sternum. So manubro sternal joint. Then another example of secondary cartilaginous joint is Ziphisternal joint, the joint between the xiphoid process and the sternum body. So Ziphisternal joint. And as you know that secondary cartilaginous joint is known as symphysis. So very commonly known symphysis, that is the pubic symphysis, is an example of secondary cartilaginous joint. So these were the cartilaginous joint. Now what else? If we go further, we are done with the fibrous joint. We are done with the cartilaginous joint, that is the immovable joint and slightly movable joint. Now it's time to talk about the freely movable or the synovial, or the joints which we know about, or the examples of the joints which we commonly know about. So it is synovial joint. So in synovial joint, first we had plain synovial joint. So example of plain synovial joint is acromio clavicular joint. It is with the joint between the acromial process and the clavicle. Okay, acromioclavicular joint. It is an example of, it is a plain synovial joint. Also the interphalangeal joint, the joint between the phalanges, is the example of plain synovial joint. Now if we go further, the second subtype was hinge joint. So hinge joint, it is very important to know that it only allows flexion and extension. This joint only allows flexion and extension. And a very common example of hinge joint is this elbow, that is allowing only flexion and extension. You cannot do any adduction and flexion in this. Also, you cannot do any pronation and supination in this. So this elbow joint is an example of hinge joint. Now the third subtype, that is a pivot. So for pivot, I'll take a pen with me. So suppose this is one bone. Suppose this is a one bone and another one is moving using it as an axis, right? So similarly, pivot bone, right? One is the axis and another bone is rotating around it. So what is the example? Example is superior and inferior radioulnar joint. So if in radius and ulna, the superior one, the near the body, that is the proximal, and the distal, that is the inferior radioulnar joint, is example of pivot joint. The interosseous membrane was example of syndesmosis, if I'm not wrong, right? So this was the example of pivot joint, that is the superior and inferior radioulnar joint. They rotate using each another as an axis. So this was pivot joint. Now what next? The fourth subtype was which joint? It was condylar joint, right? So the fourth example was the condylar joint. Very common example of condylar joint is the joint between the temporal bone and mandible. So temporomandibular joint is an example of condylar joint. Now next is the ellipsoid. So ellipsoid joint examples are the metacarpophalangeal joint, MCP, and the metatarsal phalangeal joint, that is MTP, not the MTP in radio gynecology. Okay, and another example is the atlanto-occipital joint. This MTP was metatarsal phalangeal joint, and also atlanto-occipital joint is an example of ellipsoid joint. Now the sixth is the saddle joint. So what is I told you that we'll talk the important points if any joint is having. So the saddle joint, the bones which are going to articulate with each other have concavo-convex surface for articulation. So bones have concavo-convex surface for articulation. for articulating with each other. I'll write it. Okay, so in saddle joint, the bones have concavo-convex surfaces for articulating with each other, and the very common example is the sternoclavicular joint. The very common example is sternoclavicular joint. So the joint between the sternum and the clavicle is example of the example of saddle joint. What was the example of acromioclavicular? It was the plain joint. Now at last, the ball and socket joint, the very favorite one. So the ball and socket joint are usually at three places in our body. The ball and socket joint are usually in three places in our body. First, in the upper limb. Second, it is in the lower limb. And in the lower limb also, it is at two places, right? So remember that. So in the upper limb, lower limb, and third in the ear, or I'll rather say the middle ear, right? So in upper limb, the example is the very famous shoulder joint. I'll show this one, the ball and socket joint. It shows 360-degree rotation. Then in the lower limb, it is the hip joint, and a very important, that is talocalcaneo-navicular joint. Talocalcaneo-navicular joint is an example of ball and socket joint. And at last, a joint between the ossicles, that is the incus and stapes, known as incudostapedial joint. It is also example of ball and socket joint. So in total, three places: upper limb, lower limb, and middle ear. In upper limb, shoulder; in lower limb, hip and the talocalcaneo-navicular; and in the middle ear, incudostapedial. So this was all about the types of joints. This was the basic types of joints which we should know in our daily practice. All right. So thanks for watching the video. Hope you liked it. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel, Meddysimplified. And thank you.